What up, YouTube? This your boy Anthony coming through with a not so quick video, but I have promised a video on how I have set up my R5 as a portrait photographer to quite a few people and for quite a long time, and I've never made it. So I thought I had some time today, so I am going to record it today. Now let me preface and say, I'm not a videographer, so I don't have one of those fancy Atomos 5 screen recorders and all that stuff. So I'm gonna have to just use the camera to shoot the screen. It'll get the point across. So don't go in the comments saying, oh, you should get this. No, I'm not gonna get that because I don't need it. And I'm certainly not gonna get it just to do this video. So I'm just gonna go through all the menu settings and just kind of explain how I have my R5 set up. Again, I am a portrait photographer, so I have it set up as a portrait photographer. I'm not going to go into detail on every single menu item and what it means, because to be quite frank, there's a lot of stuff in there that I have never used on any Canon camera that I've owned. I don't even know what the options, what they even mean. So if I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know. And if it's something you care about, you can Google it and look it up and get your answer. So without further ado, let's jump into the R5 and let's go through these menu items. All right, so jumping in, let's start with image quality. I shoot RAW. I do not shoot JPEG, do not use the compact RAW. There are definitely plenty of videos out there that seemingly show that there's no image degradation when using compact RAW, but for me, shooting in RAW is not a problem. So I shoot in RAW, again, no JPEG. Dual pixel RAW, I keep that disabled. That is the Canon proprietary feature where you can adjust the focal plane after the fact using their Canon DPP software. I humbly say that that stuff is very gimmicky and it's a joke to me. I'm sure there's people out there who have used it and it's either saved in image form or they find use in it. I don't. I don't see the point and purpose of it. I don't think that there's really any value, especially since you have to use Canon's terrible software anyway. So that has been disabled on every Canon camera that I've ever had and will likely always be disabled on every Canon camera that I have. Cropping aspect ratio, I obviously keep that set to full most of the time. I do utilize the 1.6 times crop when I need more reach. Now, something to keep in mind with the 1.6 times crop is that it does physically crop the image. In other words, it physically crops the RAW file. So when you use that, it is not a matter of it just taking the full image and just applying a crop that you can change in post. If you do the 1.6 time crop, it drops your megapixels down to 17 megapixels. So it does physically get rid of those extra pixels. So just keep that in mind if you use the 1.6 times crop, but it is useful when you need a little bit more reach. The 1:1, 4:3, and 16:9 aspect ratios, those are just a in-camera crop just to help you frame your image. And depending upon what software you bring the RAW file into, it may auto apply the crop, but the pixels are still there. So when you use the 1:1, 4:3, 16:9, you're still getting a 45 megapixel image. It's just applying that crop the same way that it would if you did it in Lightroom or Capture One or Photoshop or some other program of the sort. All right, so moving on, exposure compensation. Obviously, I keep that set to 0 unless I need exposure compensation. ISO speed settings. So right now I have my ISO set to auto. I actually use auto ISO quite a bit, especially when I'm shooting in aperture priority or shutter priority, because it just makes it easy. Sometimes I don't feel the need to have to adjust things like crazy. I can just let it pick what it thinks it should be. And if I need to adjust, then that's where I would use the exposure compensation. So it is really convenient to have it just set to auto. ISO speed range and auto range, I keep those at the base minimum and the base maximum. So 100, 51, 200. If you wanted to, for whatever reason, limit your ISO range, you most certainly could do that. And then the minimum shutter speed, which applies for when you're in using an auto mode. So aperture priority, shutter priority, or auto, if you use auto, it sets the minimum shutter speed that the camera will use. Now I keep mine set at 1/250th because that just works for me. There's been times where I've had it set to a 60th of a second, 1/125th of a second, and it's fine, but sometimes I'm shooting things and 1/125th or 1/60th of a second is just a tad too slow, and I get a little bit of motion blur or sometimes even camera shake. So I found that 1/250th is a sweet spot for me to where I don't have to worry about either of those things. Now, if you have it set to auto, when it's set to auto, essentially what it does, if you have it at 0, so obviously I have mine at faster because I've adjusted these settings just since I've had the camera. But when you have it set to auto, the camera essentially tries to keep your shutter speed at 1 over your focal length. So if you're shooting with, say, an 85mm, it would try to keep it at 1/100. If you had this set to 0. If you have it set to faster, and obviously there's 3 different settings for faster and 3 different settings for slower, essentially what it does is it keeps it faster or slower. So if you have it set to faster, instead of it being 1/100th of a second, it might try to do it at 1/125th of a second. If you have it all the way up to the fastest point, it's going to adjust it faster. I don't know what its increments are. I've never checked that because I don't really have this in auto anymore, and I haven't for a while. So I don't know what the increments are, but essentially you can have it be a little bit faster than 1 over your focal length or a little bit slower, whatever works for you. But I like to keep mine set to manual, 1/250th of a second. HDR, PQ settings, I keep this off. I've never used it because I have never used the HDR feature in any Canon camera I have ever owned, and probably never will because I'm just not a big fan of HDR. And if I'm going to do anything HDR, I would just take multiple shots myself and then perform the HDR in post manually. I would not let the camera do it. So the HDR PQ settings, it has to do with doing some dialed in stuff for when you're doing HDR. Again, I don't use it, so I'm not familiar with it. So if you want more info on that, you'll have to Google it. Auto lighting optimizer, I keep that disabled. That's another thing that I've never used, so I don't exactly know what it's for. So you would have to look that up to see. I don't even know if it would have anything to do with the RAW file itself. A lot of these settings are more JPEG oriented. So if you shoot RAW, I don't know that they would impact it anyway. Highlight tone priority, I keep that off. It's another thing that I don't really know what it is because I've never used it. So sorry I can't be more help on these things, but I'm just giving you the settings that I have. And if it's something I know about, I'll explain it. But some of this stuff, I've never used it, probably never will. Anti-flicker shooting, I keep that disabled. That has to do with if you are shooting under not fluorescent light necessarily, but like when you're in an arena or a gymnasium and they use those big like gas filled lights. This helps with timing the shutter to help with the flicker of those lights. Maybe it does apply for fluorescent too, I'm not sure. But I don't shoot in those situations, so I never have to use it. I've never even played around with it to see how well it works. So, you know, it is what it is. I keep that disabled. External speedlight control, obviously that has to do with speedlight stuff, so there's really no point in even talking about any of that. I really don't mess with these settings anyway. I don't shoot with the flash on camera, and even when I shoot with triggers that the camera recognizes to let me into these settings, I've really never had any use for these because I just control all of my flashes manually. So all of this stuff doesn't really matter. I don't shoot ETTL. Even when I have flashes and triggers that can handle it, I don't shoot ETTL. I learned shooting flash manually, and I've just always stuck with that. So that is that. So moving on, white balance. Obviously, this is going to change depending upon what I'm doing. That's pretty self-explanatory on your white balance. Sometimes I do shoot auto white balance, but at other times, if I'm in a specific situation, I normally like to dial it in versus just doing auto. I know I can change it in post, but I like to see what it's going to look like when I'm taking the image. So I try to get that white balance as close to possible. Custom white balance, I never use that, but what that allows you to do is to take a picture of an image and then set the white balance off of that image. I do use that feature quite a bit. So I will take a picture of a gray card wherever I'm at, and then I'll go in and set the white balance based off of that gray card. So it actually is a really useful feature, and there's no images on this card, so that's why nothing is coming up. But if there was one, you would see the image, and then you could select that image and put your point where you want to do the custom white balance, and it will do that for you. So that is very useful. White balance, shift, and bracketing. I have never used that a day of my life, probably never will. But if you want to dabble in that, you can, to get real minute on your white balance. Color space, obviously keep that sRGB. Picture style, Picture style, I like to set that to faithful. Now, for a long time, I did set it to neutral, and I liked having the image that I would see on the back of the screen very flat. So that way I didn't get consumed with color and contrast and sharpening and all of that kind of thing. And it worked well for quite a few years. But a couple years ago, I switched it and I started setting it to faithful, because typically when I edit my photos, definitely portraits at least, I usually set it to faithful anyway. Sometimes I'll use standard, or sometimes I use portrait. Very, very rarely do I use portrait, but usually I use faithful. And so I kind of found that I just like seeing a preview of what the image baseline is going to be like when I pull it into the camera. I kind of found that when I had it set to neutral and it was really flat, it actually impacted me taking pictures sometimes, because the pictures weren't looking very good on the back of the screen, and I was just thinking like, oh, this image is no good. So I would trash the image, or I would move on to a different location or a different composition, and then come to find out it actually really was okay. It just needed to be finessed in post, and it's hard to visualize that sometimes. So by setting it to faithful, I can get an idea of exactly what the baseline is going to be, and that just works for me. So obviously you can set that to whatever you want. Clarity, I keep that on 0, because I rarely use clarity anyway. And I certainly don't want to do clarity in camera. It's kind of cool that they added it. It's great for JPEG. I don't think it has any impact on RAW files. So it's cool that they put it in there. I'm not sure why it's like its own menu item like that, but you know, it is what it is. Lens aberration correction, I keep all of these things off. I don't want any of this stuff happening in camera. Most of it only deals with JPEGs anyway. I do think some of these things, maybe 1, maybe 2, I haven't looked this up in a long time, they may impact RAW files as well. But most of the stuff is impacting of JPEG, which I don't shoot anyway. But even if it impacted RAW files, I don't want the camera doing any of this stuff. Anything that I need to do to an image, I will do it in post. Don't want to waste any time having the camera trying to do it. So I keep all of that stuff disabled. Okay, long exposure noise reduction, I keep that turned off. For starters, I don't do a lot of long exposures, but also, again, like I just said, I don't want the camera doing anything in camera trying to correct anything. I will do all of that to my taste in post. Now, something to keep in mind with long exposure noise reduction is that it doubles your exposure time. So if you have a 2-minute exposure, it will take 2 minutes for the noise reduction. So for every 2 minutes, you'd have to wait a total of 4 minutes for that to happen. So if you had a really long exposure, say you had a 25-minute exposure, you would take that 25-minute exposure, then it would take 25 minutes, additional minutes, for the long exposure noise reduction to work. So definitely keep that in mind if you use that it could definitely hinder your shooting of long exposures, because you'd have to wait the same amount of time as your exposure. So I keep that off. High exposure speed noise reduction, I keep that off as well. That could be useful if you do a lot of high ISO shooting. I do believe the high ISO speed noise reduction does impact RAW files as well. So that could be useful for you if you want to use that. Dust delete data, I've never used a day in my life. I kind of don't even understand the point of it. It's really there for you to pinpoint dust spots on your sensor, and the camera will try to correct those dust spots in the image. To me, it doesn't make any sense, because I don't know why you wouldn't just clean your sensor. What's the point of letting the camera know where the dust spots are when you can just clean them? But it is what it is. So that's there. I never use it. Multiple exposure, I keep that disabled. That basically is exactly what it is. You can do multiple exposures in camera. It is kind of cool. I've played around with it. I haven't used it a ton because multiple exposure isn't really my thing. But it is really fun to do it in camera. So it's really cool because you can take the first picture and then it'll overlay that over top of the live view, kind of like a virtual or an augmented reality type thing. And then it'll help you kind of compose your next images. And then it'll, put them all together and create the file. So it's a cool feature. I don't really use it, but it is a cool feature if you're into multiple exposure, that sort of thing. HDR mode, I keep that off. Again, I don't use anything HDR in camera. Focus bracketing, I keep that disabled because I don't do focus bracketing. I'm sure that will come in handy for macro stuff, but for me as a portrait shooter, I have no use for it. Interval timer, I keep that disabled, obviously, unless I need it. Very useful for if you're doing time lapses, or if you just want to just have the camera just take multiple pictures in a set amount of time. It is useful. I do use it sometimes when I'm doing like group photos that I have to be in. I'll set the interval timer so that way it could just take a bunch without me having to run back and forth or use a remote. Bulb timer is disabled because I don't have the mode set in bulb. I don't know why you can't change the mode with this. You literally have to set the mode to bulb timer and then enable the bulb timer. It's kind of it's stupid the way that they did that, but whatever. Shutter mode, I keep it mechanical. I rarely use electronic shutter. I think I have used it just to use it when I first got the camera, but I really have had no need to use electronic shutter. The shutter on the R5 is really quiet anyway, and I have never found the need to the 20 frame per second that comes with electronic. So I've just always kept it on mechanical, but it is cool. The electronic shutter is cool. Release shutter without card, for the life of me, I don't know why Canon continues to keep this as an option. And even more baffling is that they default it to on. I don't know why you would ever want the camera to allow you to take a picture without a card and not alert you that there's no card in there. So you go through a whole shoot only to find out that you have not a single picture. I don't get it. I don't know why it's still there, but obviously I keep that off because I don't want to be taking pictures if I don't have a card. IS mode, it's off at the moment because I don't have a lens on there, but that is your image stabilizer. I normally keep it on when shooting. So you could either have it on always or on while shooting. I just keep it on while shooting because I don't need it to be draining the battery, just always having it trying to stabilize stuff when I'm not even trying to take a picture. The still photo IS and the focal length, which are grayed out, those apply for when you have a lens that doesn't have IS built into it. So unfortunately, you can't control your lens IS and your in-body image stabilization separately. So if you turn on IS on the lens, it turns on IBIS. If you turn IS off on the lens, it turns off IBIS, I believe. They're connected. So when you have a lens that doesn't have IS, the still photo IS and the focal length, those options will open up. And I guess it helps with the IBIS. I don't really know what the purpose of them. I'm assuming it helps its algorithm to figure out how to stabilize the sensor or whatever the case may be. But I don't really touch those. I just kind of leave the IBIS as it is and going about my day. Touch shutter, I leave that disabled. I just don't like the camera to take a picture if I touch the screen, so I keep that disabled. Image review, I have that off. I don't like the image popping up when I'm taking multiple pictures, so I've had it off for quite some time in quite a few cameras, just because when I need to look at the picture, I'll go back to the play menu and look at the picture, but I don't need it popping up every time. It just kind of messes with the flow of what I'm doing. So I keep that off. High speed display, I don't remember what that is. You'll have to Google it. Metering timer, I've always kept this to 4 seconds. That's the default, I believe. I've never changed it. I don't even know what impact it has to change these to something else because I've never changed it. It's always been, it defaults to 4 seconds. I keep it at 4 seconds. Exposure simulation, I keep that enabled most of the time. Obviously, when you put a flash on there, it will auto disable that. But it is nice to have the exposure simulation. That's kind of one of the benefits of having the mirrorless camera, is that you can see what your image is going to look like before you take it. So if you disable that, it'll essentially be like looking through an optical. Actually, not really. If you disable it, it just keeps the image bright. So you really don't know if the image is going to be overexposed or underexposed. It just always tries to keep your viewpoint consistent and, you know, equal good exposure. So, you know, is there a point in using it when it's not flash? Honestly, I don't know what the point is. I'm sure for some people there's a reason. I'm not saying don't use it. So, you know, don't blow me up in the comments about it. But for me, I keep it enabled most of the time. I'm sure there are times where I may disable it, but for the most part, I keep it enabled. Shooting info display, man, there's a lot of stuff in here. You know, this is all to taste. There's really no point in going through all this stuff. You know, it's like you set it up the way that you like it, you know, so based off of the information that you want to see, you can set these things up to show what you want it to show, not show what you don't want it to show. Yeah, I mean, that stuff is pretty self-explanatory, really. Okay, and then the last one in the shoot menu, VS display format, I go with display 2. I just like that better, so that way I'm not pushed into the corner trying to see the corners of the image. So I like display 2. And then the display performance, I've always kept that on power setting. I've actually never shot this camera with it set to smooth, because for what I shoot, again, as a portrait shooter, I don't need a fast refresh rate in the viewfinder. That obviously impacts battery life, and I don't need it. There's no point in me having it. So I've always had it set to power saving. Okay, moving on to the AF menu. So AF operation, obviously right now it's manual focus because I don't have a lens on it. The AF method is set to 1 point. Subject to detect is people. You can obviously set that to animals if that's your thing, or you can set it to no priority. From what I have seen, if it is set to animals, it still detects people fairly well. So if you kind of do both, you can set it to animal and let it do its thing for people as well. Eye detection is normally enabled. It's only disabled now because I don't have a lens on. I guess I should have put a lens on before I did this, but whatever. So normally eye detection is set to enable. Continuous AF, I keep that disabled. Basically, I don't know why anybody would ever want this to be enabled. It essentially will always try to lock autofocus even when you're not pushing the shutter button. So if you're just walking around and the camera is dangling on your side, it's still trying to lock focus. It will literally be in a continuous focusing hunt mode, and it destroys battery life. And that would be unnecessary wear and tear on your AF motor. There's no reason for it to try to track focus when you're not taking a picture. I don't know who would use continuous AF. Maybe if you're on a tripod, I don't know what the case studies would be to where it would make sense to have that enabled. I keep that disabled. Touch and drag AF settings. Although I have this set, I actually never use it. I never use it. I guess I just haven't really found where I need to do the AF using the screen. You know, having the joystick makes it really easy for me, but I do have it set up. So I have it enabled. I have the positioning as relative. If you have it to absolute, what that essentially means is that your position on the screen will correlate to where you want the focus to be, versus if you have it set to relative, no matter where you touch, it starts where the autofocus point is at that point. So for example, if your autofocus point was here, okay, and you touched over here, it would just move your point over there. Where if it's relative and it's here, when you start here, if you move it a little bit to the left, it'll move it a little bit to the left right here. So I like to have that set to relative, and I keep the touch area to the top right. So you obviously can pick whatever makes sense for you. It is a useful thing, and it does make moving the autofocus point easy. It's just, I think for me, it's not intuitive for me to use this screen to try to move the focus point. I just haven't got to a point where that makes sense for me, because that's just not been the way that I've moved my focus point with any of my other cameras. So I just don't really use it that much, but I at least set it up just in case if I, want to use it. MF peaking settings, I have that on, I have the level high, and I have the color red. So basically that just helps for when you're doing manual focus. There's some little indicators to help you know when you have the image in focus. So that's what that pertains to. The focus guide, I keep that on, and maybe that's what I was just explaining. The focus guide, maybe the two of these together, they help you when you're doing manual focus. And you know what, I should have put a lens on. That's my fault, guys. AF assist beam firing, I keep that off because when it's on, if you're in low light, it emits like an IR beam to try to help with focusing, but it's kind of freaky when it does it for the person that you're shooting. And I can't remember if it's, I actually think the beam is like an amber light on the front, I think. I think the other thing that I was thinking of was the one that's on the flash where it kind of emits a red grid. This one I think is just the amber light up front. I just don't like it. I just find that it's kind of distracting, and so I just work with low light in a different way. I don't really use that. This camera focuses really well at low light anyway, so I've never found where I've even needed to turn that on anyway. So the cases, I always keep it on one. I really don't mess around with any of these other cases. I haven't found any need to do so. Again, I'm just a portrait shooter. So if you are a sports shooter or a wildlife shooter or a bird photographer or something of that sort, then these cases would be much more applicable for you. But me doing portrait, I don't have a lot of fast movement or anything of the sort to where I really need to get into the nitty gritty of doing these autofocus cases. So I've always kept it on one, just the standard versatile multi-purpose setting, and it has worked flawless for me with the R5. It has worked flawless for me for every camera that I've had that has the option to do these cases. So again, based on your style of shooting, you might want to play around with this and do different stuff. You can get in very detailed on how you do all these settings. So if you do other stuff, it wouldn't be a bad idea to play with that a little bit more. Lens electronic MF, can't even talk. I'm like this. I'm talking so much. Lens electronic MF, I keep it off. I really don't even know what it's for. One shot AF released prior. I have mine set to focus priority. So you could either do release priority, which means that it will just release even if it doesn't lock focus, just so that way you can get, at least take images. I prefer to have it lock focus and have that be the priority before it takes pictures, because for me, what good does it do me to have a picture if it's not in focus? So I would rather have just not got the shot versus have a bunch of out of focus shots that I can't use anyway. So I keep that on focus priority. Switching track subjects. I think this defaulted to one and I have not changed it. I haven't even done any research to even see what that's about. So I've just kept that at the default. Lens drive when AF impossible, I keep that on because I don't like, so essentially what that is if it tries to find focus and it basically goes the entire focus range and back and it can't lock focus, it'll just stop. And it won't attempt to, focus. And then you kind of have to do manual focus to get something kind of in focus for it to try to lock back in again. And that's annoying to me. I would rather just keep trying to hunt as I'm moving the camera versus me having to do manual focus to kind of get something in focus first before it does its thing. So I keep that set to on. I do not limit any of the AF methods. You can do that if there's things in here that you never use, but I like to just keep them all there just in case. AF method selection control, I have it set to main dial. And orientation link points, I have it separate AF points. So I like it to be different points, whether I'm shooting in portrait mode or I'm shooting in landscape mode. If you have that set to same for both, it'll keep that same point. And normally for me, if I'm shooting in, say, landscape mode and then I switch to portrait mode, I'm going to be using a different focus point. So I would rather it keep track of the focus point in each orientation versus using the same one every time. All right. And then to round out the AF menu, initial servo AF point for face tracking. I have it set to this option here. I did some research on what this was and I just kind of picked something. I've done no testing or really barely any research to know how much of a difference this option makes. So if this is something you're curious about, you'll just have to Google that one. Focus ring rotation. I keep that to normal because why would I want to reverse it? I guess maybe that would make sense for people coming from a different system to where that makes sense. RF lens, MF, focus ring sensitivity. I really haven't touched that because I don't own any RF glass at the moment. So I just have kept that to the default. Sensitivity for the AF point select, I have that set to -1, and then electronic full-time manual focus, I have that turned off. Okay, moving on to playback. I don't really mess with any of these things. Just about all of this stuff is set to how it is for default. I don't touch any of it because I don't really care about any of the playback settings. I don't really use any of this stuff. I rarely do any rating in camera. Normally, if I'm doing something where I have to rate something, I'm probably shooting tethered and I would just annotate it there. Yeah, all of this stuff is default. I don't touch any of this stuff. Print order, photo book setup, never used it, never touched it. Raw processing, resize, cropping, all of this stuff. It's all the default. Haven't touched it. Slideshow, set image search conditions, never. Magnification, I do set that to actual size from the selected point. That works really well for me. So what that does is when I take an image and I zoom in, it goes to the actual size. So it's full size and it takes me to where the focus point is. So this is really good for me to make sure when I'm doing portraits that the eyes are tack sharp, and it'll take me right to the eye because I'm always focused on the eye anyway. So it'll take me right to the eye, full size, and I can check to make sure that's tack sharp before I move on to something else. So that is a time saver. If you do some of these other things where it's just, 2 time from center or 8 time from center, that sort of thing, you have to magnify it. Then you have to move it around, use the joystick to move it around to find the point that you want. And that's a waste of time for me. So I want it to go right to the point where I'm focused. Since I don't have to focus and recompose like the old days, there's no place I would want to be when I'm looking at it than where I'm focusing to make sure that that's good. Image jump, I have that set to 1. Yep. These things, memo, audio quality, rate button function. I think I did change this to be the record memo because I never used the rate button in camera. So I set it to the memo. I've never recorded an audio memo. It's kind of cool that you can, but I've literally never done it. I don't even know that I would, but that's how I have that set. Highlight alert, I keep that enabled. I do like to see the blinkies to let me know if I've got some overexposed highlights. The AF point display, I have that disabled. If you have that enabled when you're doing the playback and you're looking at the image on the screen, it'll have a little square where the autofocus point is at. That can be useful for me. It kind of gets in the way of me looking at the image. So I've just always had that disabled for quite some time. Playback grid, I also keep that off because that also impacts and negatively impacts me looking at the image. I don't want there to be any of that stuff on it. I just want to look at the image. So I keep that grid off. And then the movie play count, keep that to record time. That's probably the default. Moving on to Wi-Fi. I never use Wi-Fi on this camera. I have it set up, but I never use it. I don't use Bluetooth. It's cool that it has it. It's just not something that I really have used with my workflow. I've not really needed it. So yeah, all of that stuff, I just set it up just so that it would work, but that's about the extent of it. All right, moving on to the setup menu. So record, function, card, blah, blah, blah. So I record to both cards, and I record options. So that's video standard. Not sure what that means, but yeah, so I record RAW to both. Some people will record RAW to one card and JPEG to the other. For me, I just record both. Again, I don't do a lot of high-speed shooting. So obviously if I was doing a lot of high-speed shooting, the bottleneck would be recording the RAW file to the SD card, which is obviously not going to be as fast as the CF Express card. But since I don't really do continuous shooting much at all, that's not an impact for me. I would rather just have the RAW file to both cards. And then I do the playback from card one. Doesn't really matter, you know, which cards you're playing back. You can decide that however you see fit. File numbering, I like to keep that to continuous. It's kind of just an easy way for me to keep track of the shutter count. Not that I really care about that too much, but it's just cool just to kind of keep a continuous running count of the images. You could have that just set to manual, or every time you reformat the card, it would restart those. File name, you set your file name. I have that set for something. Format card is what it is. Auto rotate, I have that only to auto rotate on the computer when I transfer the stuff. I don't like it to auto rotate in camera, because if I'm shooting in portrait mode, I want to be able to review the image in portrait mode. If you have it set to auto rotate in camera as well, when you're doing portrait shots, it will display those in a horizontal format. And so it's just hard to see the image. So I keep that set to only on the computer do I want that to do that. Add rotate info. I think that defaulted to disabled, and I have left it that way because I really don't even know what that means. Date time is date time. Language, obviously English. Video system here in America, NTSC. Help text size, small. You can change that to standard if you need to see that. The beep, I keep disabled. That is the AF beep. I keep that disabled most of the time because it's just annoying for me and other people. So unless I really need to be able to hear it, I keep that off. Headphone volume is what it is. Power savings. Display off time is 5 minutes now because I'm recording this video. Normally I have it set to 1 minute. Auto power off, I have set to 5 minutes, and viewfinder off, I have set to 1 minute. 1 minute just kind of worked for me. I used to do 30 seconds, but 30 seconds, things would just shut off a little bit too fast, and it was just kind of annoying. So I changed that to 1 minute, and it works well. Eco mode, I keep off. I don't really have a problem with battery life, and I have the grip, so I have 2 batteries anyway, so I don't need the camera trying to do anything to save battery power. Screen, viewfinder, display. I go back and forth on this. It really just depends on what kind of shooting I'm doing and what I need it to do. So right now I have it set to auto, where it's only the screen. So it won't go to the viewfinder. So even if I put my face up to the viewfinder, it won't go there. And I kind of have set it that way because sometimes the sensor on that viewfinder it's a little too sensitive in my opinion. So sometimes just holding the camera up kind of to my face, but I don't have it close enough to be looking in the viewfinder, it'll switch and then it'll switch off the screen. So I don't like that. So I kind of have it usually set to only be on the screen there. I can't remember what's the difference between auto only screen and having it set to just the screen. Yeah, I'm not sure what you'll have to look that up. I can't remember. But I just know I like to have mine set to where I normally will only see things on the screen unless I plan on shooting with the viewfinder. And it depends. Sometimes I do like to use the viewfinder Sometimes I like to use the screen. It really just depends on the situation. Like if I'm doing an event, I will typically do primarily shooting through the viewfinder because that just makes sense for an event. But sometimes if I'm just doing some casual chill portrait stuff, I'll just use the screen. Or if I'm doing something down low or up high, you know, I'll use the screen. I just don't like it to switch back and forth because, again, like I said, that sensor on that viewfinder is just a little too sensitive for me. Screen brightness, I keep right in the middle at 4, works well for me. Viewfinder brightness, I have that set to auto. That was a new feature I think that they added with one of the firmwares, I believe. Screen viewfinder color tone, I have it set to standard, which is kind of like 5500 Kelvin daylight. One is a little too warm and these other ones are too cool. So I just keep it as standard. That works for me. Fine tune viewfinder color tone. I've never done that. You can if you want. And UI magnification disabled. I don't think I've ever used that option. I don't even know what it does. So I keep that disabled. HDMI resolution, I keep that set to 1080p. I don't know what auto would do. I don't use HDMI with this, so that's an irrelevant option for me. Touch control, I keep it standard. I definitely don't want it any more sensitive. I do disable it sometimes, but normally I just keep it on standard. Multifunction lock, this just controls the things that are locked when you enable the lock. So I just have, if I set the lock, I just have the control ring on the lens and the touch control locked. I still want to be able to use these things. It really is, the screen is normally the only thing that I would want to lock to where it didn't get in the way. Shutter at shutdown, I close it. I don't know why you would want to leave it open. Not sure why that's an option. Maybe if you want it to clean and you just want to turn the camera off, not sure, but I have that closed. And then sensor cleaning, I have it at auto power off. Now, one of the things that's annoying about that, and I wish there was either an option to set this, or I wish Canon would change it. It's annoying that it does the sensor cleaning when it powers down in your power saving mode. So if you remember on that screen where I had the power off set to 5 minutes, every time it hits that 5 minutes, it does the cleaning. And it's just kind of annoying because for me, like, I want at power off to be when I flip the switch off, not when the camera basically goes into standby mode, which is what that power off really is doing. So it's kind of annoying that, you know, every time it does that, it's doing this auto cleaning. It's not a huge deal, but it's just annoying that it does that. I wish I could just have it set to where it only does it once when I physically turn the camera off. Now I know some people don't, they never turn their camera off, like unless they're taking the batteries out. But yeah, I just wish that was an option, but you know, it is what it is. All right, reset camera is exactly that. You can reset the camera back to its factory state. Custom shooting modes, I don't have anything set on those. I've never used custom shooting modes on any camera that I've owned. I know they're probably very useful, very helpful, but for me, it's just not something that I've needed to introduce into my workflow. And then the save load cam settings on card, that was also a new feature that they added with the firmware, where you can copy your settings and then apply those into another R5 camera. And then rounding it out, battery info is battery info. Pretty self-explanatory there. Copyright information is copyright information. Manuals and software URLs is just information. You can scan that thing to get the manual and that sort of thing. Certification logo display. I'm sure that's just some legal thing that they have to have. And firmware version 1.31. Okay, so now going into the custom function settings. So exposure level increments, I keep that set to 1/3 stops. You could do half stops. I just like the ability to be able to control it at a 1/3 stop. Same thing with my ISO speed. I like to be able to change that at 1/3 stops. I remember when I had my Canon T4i, you can only do it in 1-stop increments, and it's annoying because that's too much. But it's weird that if you are shooting in like an aperture priority or a shutter priority and you have the ISO set to auto, it will adjust it in 1/3 stops, but you can't do it manually. So I like to have that finer control to do 1/3 stops. Speed from metering, auto ISO, I think that was set to that function, and I just kept it that way because I don't even know what that means. So I'm sure that was just the default. Bracketing auto cancel is on. That is when you have bracketing set, once it does its images, it will turn off. I like to have it cancel that because I'll forget. I'll have bracketing set and then I'll forget, and then the next time I pick up a camera, it's going to take it and then I got to go manually turn it off. I would just rather cancel. Bracketing sequence, I like to do under, normal, over. So that's the setting I have. You could have it do correct, under, over, or over, correct, under. It's totally up to you. Obviously it doesn't really make a difference. This is all pure personal preference on how you want it to do it. And then your number of bracketed shots, that's totally up to you on what you want. Safety shift, I keep that off. I don't know what that feature is. Same exposure for new aperture, I keep that off. I also do not know what that applies to. AE lock metering mode after focus. I have it set to evaluative, but I don't really know what that applies to. Restrict shooting modes is off. I have no reason to do that. I don't have a shutter speed range or an aperture range set. I basically have it set to the full distance. So lowest to highest. If you wanted to limit that, you could. Don't know why you would want to, but if you wanted to, you could. Dial direction, I keep that normal. No reason to reverse it. Control ring rotation, I keep that normal. Okay, customize buttons. So, man, if anything, this is probably what a lot of people care about when it comes to how these things are set up. So, my shutter button, I have that set to just metering start. I use back button focus. I have it set that way now. I know I had a video where I said I don't use it as much, and I don't. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I definitely go back and forth on this. I would say I tend to keep it at default. I'll keep it at back button focus just because I'm so used to it. But sometimes when I'm doing actual portrait sessions, I'll change that back if I don't need to separate the two, because again, like I said in that video, it's just an unnecessary press sometimes. But currently, as of today, I have the shutter button set to just the metering. The movie record button is set to movie recording. The mode button is set to mode. So I have the AF on button that is set to metering and AF start. And then the star button is also set to that. But the cool thing about this camera is that if you go into it and you hit the info button, you can have it set to what you want the button to do, like what type of autofocus you want. So as you can see, if I go back, which button am I on here? Okay, so on the AF on button, I have that set to when I hit that, it's going to be servo, and it's going to be eye autofocus, and then the servo AF characteristics are basically whatever settings I currently have set for that autofocus. So essentially what this means is I have the AF on button set for my eye autofocus. And then I have the star button set to be the autofocus that I have the camera set to. So normally I have it set to like single point and all of that stuff. So essentially what I have is I have a designated eye autofocus button. And this is very useful because sometimes IAF doesn't work. It can't find the eye, or sometimes, if people are looking away, or if there's multiple people in it and the camera is just kind of picking and choosing which eye at once, it's very useful to be able to quickly just go back to single point autofocus where I can just set that point and get the image. So it works really well to have this dual autofocus set up to where I can do either method. So that's how I have that set up. I have the AF point button set to AF point selection. And then I have the depth of field preview set to change between one shot AF and servo. So this is really nice. So for my star button that I have AF, if I want to change that button between one shot and servo, I'll just hit the depth of field preview button. So that's really nice because I don't always want to shoot in servo, but sometimes if there's going to be movement or if there's something I need to track, it's nice just to quickly hit that depth of field preview button, change my focus to servo, and then I can still do my one shot in servo, or I can do my eye autofocus. So it gives me total control in a very quick way of how I want to have my autofocus set up based on what's going on. And then the lens AF stop button, I have it set to AF off, but I don't own any RF glass, so this is an irrelevant setting for me. Yeah, the manual function button I have set to the dial function settings, so it basically lets me go through the function menu at the top or something like that. The illumination light button I have set for eye detection, so that brings up the menu for I believe it brings up the menu for people, animals, and no priority, but it might be just to turn eye detection on and off. I can't remember, but I have that set for that. And then the set button is the set to the direct AF method selection. Can't exactly remember what that is, but I'm sure it makes sense for how I have it set up. And then obviously I have the joystick set to move the AF points, so I can just move those around. So all of my dials are really set up to help with autofocus. My structure is set up for me to be able to dial in that autofocus very, very quick, because if I'm doing an event or if I'm doing something to where, you know, things are changing rapidly, I need to be able to change how the camera is focusing without having to think about it. So that's kind of the way that my whole menu or button structure is set up to help me quickly adjust autofocus settings. And then customized dials. So as you can see, I have the one up top set to the shutter speed. I have the rotating dial set to ISO. And then I have the dial on the back of the camera set to the aperture. And then I have the control ring set to off, because again, I don't have any RF glass, so that's an irrelevant dial ring for me anyway. And then obviously you have the clear customized settings if you wanted to revert back. Add cropping information, I have that set to off. Don't even know what that applies to, never have used it. Audio compression I have off, don't need any audio compression. Default erase option, I have that set to cancel. So basically when you're viewing an image and you hit the delete button, where do you want it to highlight? I have it canceled just so that way I don't accidentally delete a button if I hit the delete by default. Yeah, you do have to hit something twice, but you'd be surprised sometimes when you're moving really fast and you have bigger fingers, you can hit stuff. So I like to just have it default to being on cancel. Release shutter without a lens, I have that off. It's kind of like that feature with the, you know, take picture without a card. You know, why would I need to be able to hit the shutter button if there's no lens on it? You know, I don't know. There must be a reason for it. Retract lens on power off. I have it set to on. I don't have any lenses that would apply to, but I keep it on just to have it on. And then I add IPTC information. I have it off. I don't know what IPTC information is. Don't care. And then you have clear all custom functions. And then I have the Mize tab. So this one I do have set up to just have information that I need to get to. So I basically have kind of crafted this over time and have kept tabs on, you know, what type of stuff I need out of the menu that I want to get to quickly. And I just put those things here. So that way I don't have to go through all of the menus to find what I need. All of those things are just here. So this works really well. Obviously you would want to set this up for what works for you. So that is how I have my R5 set up. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. This is definitely a long video, but there is a lot of menu items in the R5. So hopefully that helped you out, or at least was entertaining, or you can compare that to how you have your R5 set up. I appreciate you tuning in. Appreciate you rocking with me. Until next time, you know the drill. Take care. See you soon.